decades of time. Your dial is now set to entering the mind. Presented by Riot Material. Your hosts and co-conspirators through life, C. Von Hassett and Rachel Reid Wilkie.
Entering the Mind was written almost entirely from a state of meditation. While in retreat, you meditated, then wrote, and so on until Entering the Mind took form as a book. You are a decades-long practitioner of the ancient Tibetan practice known as Dzogchen. Dzogchen is unique in that the teachings are passed down from master to student, an unbroken lineage of teachings in the form of a mind transmission. Let's talk about Dzogchen and its tradition of an unbroken lineage.
So Dzogchen is really pointing you towards the nature of your own mind. And this mind is timeless. It's open, spacious. So there is no cutoff point at all with it, nor with the teachers who are introducing you to it. Mm-hmm. So in being introduced to it, you enter the lineage of the great masters and the tradition itself. Mm-hmm. And in practicing every day and deepening your practice in the nature of your own mind and your natural state, you are basically, swimming in this ancient tradition that goes beyond Earth, that goes, according to the masters, to 13 solar systems, star systems in the universe. It's not just a planetary wisdom practice. It's timeless and everywhere. So the unbroken lineage, when they speak to that, they're speaking to this tradition as being passed down from mouth to ear oftentimes. But nowadays it's more, if you go visit a teacher wherever they're giving a seminar, and there might be a dozen practitioners or hundreds of practitioners, and you'll spend the weekend with them and receive teachings on different aspects of mind, and then they give you a transmission. That this transmission is basically direct in the sense that you might as well be getting it from the Buddha himself, because it's been passed down person to person to person to person right to you.
So it's a living teaching,
it's
as it
living.
were. It's alive within the teachers and the masters, and it's alive as they transmit it to you as a student.
Yes. And you feel this entity as it enters you. Mm-hmm. The teaching continues to teach even when the master leaves and goes his way. It's still in there and it's still speaking to you, and you're still engaged with it. It becomes a partner in your own awakening.
Mm, that's awesome.
Yeah.
I know that you mentioned in the book the old way in which the master used to transmit to their student, and back in the day, the master perhaps would only select one student in their group who they would honor with this transmission, and this one transmission would happen in the lifetime of the master, and it was also secretly transmitted to the student. And this is a lovely passage in the book that speaks to one teacher in particular who passed it to his student through a hole in the cave using a straw and whispering it into his ear.
Like a stick of hay. Back in the day, and even today, these monasteries have many, many students, many of them practicing for decades. And the master would only be allowed to pass the Dzogchen teachings along to one student in his lifetime.
Wow.
And so he had to choose carefully, and this one master that I reference in the book, he actually felt the student that was most worthy was this 3-year-old child. Gosh. Who was probably a reincarnation of some other Rinpoche, and yet the child was too young and the master was getting old. And he knew he had to pass this teaching along. So he actually selected this very old practitioner, probably in his 70s. And indeed, that practitioner awakened, but he had to give it to this guy. He was in his cell, and the master was in his cell, and there was a little hole punched through the wall, and he got this stick of hay, and he stuck it through that hole, and he whispered these teachings to him, so nobody else in the monastery could hear it.
Right.
And of course, it did his job. According to all accounts, this practitioner
was instantly awakened,
enlightened
upon receiving this transmission.
Right, just in time.
For both of them, it sounds.
Yeah. So I'm sure the 3-year-old got his teachings at some point.
Yes.
Yeah.
So this idea of the mind, and I know there are many beautiful Eastern philosophies and Eastern practices out there for us all to gravitate towards, and some may be confused a little bit by the word mind, because a lot of the modern talk, let's say, that is centered around meditation speaks to the mind almost in derogatory terms, suggesting that the mind is that which distracts. The mind is that with a continual flow of thought. And we tend to put down the role of the mind. But Dzogchen speaks specifically to the idea that mind is all, and we have a conceptual mind and we have a non-conceptual mind. And it is through the training of the conceptual mind we will ultimately reveal the true essence of our mind, which is that of the non-conceptual mind.
Yeah.
So could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, it's interesting and it's ironic because in order to get to the non-conceptual mind, you need the conceptual mind to kind of like as a toehold of sorts, as a way in. You're using your conceptual mind to kind of understand the teachings in the first place. The teachings are written in such a way to address this conceptual mind, to allow it to kind of soften it up, so it can begin to get its head around, so to speak, these teachings. Dzogchen is unique in the sense that, all of the spiritual traditions, including going back to the Gnostic tradition of Christianity, they speak to, go within. And this within, for many, is in regards to emptiness, that everything is empty. There is no solidity to anything, So Dzogchen speaks to this as well. But what Dzogchen, how it's different, is in unity with this emptiness is awareness. And this is our mind. And Dzogchen gives you the tools to recognize your own specific awareness. So it's beautiful in the sense that you can receive these teachings and you get them as a conceptual being. You as a egoic individual are going to these masters and reading the teachings and trying to understand them with your conceptual mind. But through meditation practice, you learn to kind of drop the ego. You learn to see past it. And just in seeing past it, you begin to recognize that this awareness is there that gives rise to the ego. This awareness is there that gives rise to the conceptual mind as well. And so you learn to become more familiar with this, what they call the natural state. And that natural state is the non-conceptual awareness within ourselves that gives rise to the conceptual self, which also gives rise to the ego and the I.
So we've got this this emptiness, which is space. It could be related to space. We move through space. We exist in space. Space exists within us. And this, not from a scientific perspective, is empty. We know from quantum physics that space is alive and buzzing with a network of plonks that are communicating constantly as a field of information. But from a conceptual perspective, space is empty. We move through space. Space allows us to move through it. And that space is also within us. So we are also, we arise within that emptiness of space. But the space itself may be empty, while awareness exists within that emptiness and yet is cognizant. So this idea of awareness is empty yet cognizant leads us to the idea that awareness is aware of itself.
Yeah. So when we say empty, that's often a troubling term. It seems a bit ambiguous, but in reality, everything in this universe, we name it something. You have a house, and we think of a house as a singular entity. So we're in agreement, that's a house. In reality, when you look at a house, it's not a singular entity. It's made up of hundreds and hundreds of different things, and each of those things are made up of hundreds and hundreds of different things.
Mm-hmm.
So you'll never find the house in the house, because when you begin to look directly at the house, you see, well, there's a door, there's a window, there's a sash, there's a carpet, there's
Mm-hmm.
a bathroom, and this is the same for the person as well, the body. Like, this is my body, and if I was to say, okay, point to your body, where are you in that body? And you touch the leg. Well, that's the leg. That's not the body. To where the body, it can never be found. There is no body there. In reality, it's all space. And so this is what emptiness means. It means we label things, and the labels are good because we can agree that that's how we can speak to each other.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how the Dzogchen teachings are communicated to us. They speak, they use labels, they use the terms that we can all agree on,
Mm-hmm.
that we all understand, but it's our job now to not only look past the label, but even look past the label of ourself, to
Right.
get down into this idea of, where am I in this body of mine? And when I'm thinking, like, I'm angry at this person, or I feel sad about this, and really the Dzogchen teachings teach you to look where this I is, and you ultimately can never find it.
Mm-hmm.
What you do find, you clearly see the emptiness of your own body, and you also see the awareness that is not essentially aligned with the body. Yes, it's grounded in the body, but the awareness, you begin to see that the body is within the awareness. And through meditation practice, through going deep, you begin to really get a sense that this awareness is actually the essence of who you are. And this breaks down the I entity.
Mm-hmm.
This breaks down the ego, because
Mm-hmm.
no longer are you coming from that solid place of me, mine, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. So when you speak to this, obviously these are great intellectual ideas. They're, concepts that we can grasp, and, we're an educated group of people, individuals and community, that can grasp these ideas intellectually. But the Dzogchen teachings speak to the ultimate experience of this knowledge through practice. And you cannot attain this knowledge unless you practice. So although, to your point, many of the teachings and the masters themselves are great scholars. I mean, they know hundreds and thousands of texts after texts, ancient scripts, and in Sanskrit, in Tibetan, in all different languages, and they're extremely learned individuals, and yet they put the priority on practice.
Yeah.
And that is because you only know this from a sense of knowing through practice.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the Tibetan tradition is a rigorous intellectual tradition and philosophical tradition. I mean, these guys are wickedly intelligent. The ones who've been raised in a monastery, they're reading books all the time. They're reading who said what. They know which tradition things come out of, and they could just on spot tell you. You ask a random question in a retreat, and the master just goes back centuries to who originally said that one phrase. I mean, they're amazing. And yet they'll also tell you, throw all that stuff away. Sometimes these books are a crutch, because if you're not actually practicing, if you're not actually going deep into your own meditation, then intellect, you're still at the surface. You're still, moving around in conceptual thinking.
Right.
So it's critical, but what the books and the teachings and the reading and all that intellect does, it does point you in the right direction. And of course, if you have the guidance of a master to, while you're meditating, to say, tell me what you're seeing, move this way, go that way, like they are the guy on the road who's telling you which way to go. So you
Right.
kind of need the full body of it all. But most importantly, you need to be sitting, giving yourself time to go deep, to let the mind settle, let awareness rise, let yourself rest in all of that, and just become familiar with it. That's it. And you just
Yes.
continue to rest in it, become familiar with it, and then over time, you just begin to realize. You don't become awakened, but you get an understanding of really what's going on.
This idea of training, then, what we are looking at is train the conceptual mind to go slower. I mean, that's step number one, is to begin to witness the conceptual mind and the myriad thoughts that race through in a stream-like flow, and to observe and watch and witness thought. Because of course our conceptual mind expresses itself with thought. And that's not to say that the thoughts are bad. There are no good thoughts, bad thoughts. I mean, I'm sure from a moral perspective, people would judge whether a thought is good or bad. But in the context of meditation, there are no good thoughts and bad thoughts. Thoughts come. They are a product of the brain. It's the way that the mind expresses itself within awareness. So the first step is to observe, is to witness. And from there, you begin to slow down the thoughts. You're able to witness them. You're able to almost see when they begin and almost see when they end. And then you have this moment, which the Buddhists refer to as the gap, where you're aware of a thought ending. There's a very slight gap for a nanosecond, and then a new thought begins. So talk about this, because this, in Dzogchen tradition, speaks to the first step, which is recognize your innate mind. Then you move into resting in that innate mind, and then ultimately, with time, you develop realization. So speak a little bit to this sort of flow of training, and over time how that develops to an awakened state.
Yeah, so the training is, as you say, just when you meditate, you're going in to look at yourself. You're going in to look at your mind in the process of doing everything it does. And usually that's just thinking like a mad dog. You're thinking. This thinking is continually going to be tripping up your meditation at the beginning, because those thoughts are pulling you in every direction. Then you bring yourself back, you watch the thoughts, and you get pulled again. So the training there is to learn to watch your thoughts without getting distracted, of course. That involves this another thing we talk about in the book called shamatha practice, which is really training the mind to stabilize. So you can look at these thoughts, because really the one thing that's going to trip you up in your practice is your own thoughts, is the thinking process.
Right.
There's nothing else. It doesn't matter what's going on in your life. If you're thinking about it in such a way, it's going to be the one thing that's going to pull you out of a clean meditation practice. So you observe your thoughts, and in that observation, again, as you say, you begin to see these openings. So you do practice on looking at that space, but the space begins to open anyways when you stabilize the mind, when you begin to relax.
Mm-hmm.
And you start with the teachings, you're like, what am I looking for in this space? Well, you're looking for this awareness. You're looking for the awareness that gives rise to the thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And so the training goes on from there. And it's there's a lot involved in this Dzogchen training, but that's kind of the opening, the beginning bits, like recognizing that the thinking is the problem.
Right.
And again, it's not a problem, because when you begin to deepen in your practice, the thoughts still come. You never stop thinking. That's the
Right.
nature of our awareness. One of its expressions is thought.
Right. It's actually the attachment to that
It's
thought.
it's
that-
attaching to thought,
yes.
getting lost in the thought, letting that thought pull you out of your presence
Right.
into some other state of being. But early on, your job is to observe the thoughts, maintain presence.
Mm-hmm.
When you recognize that you've been distracted, pull yourself back into the presence, and that's the beginning practice.
Right. Wonderful. There's one chapter in the book called The View, which is clearly, in the metaphor, the view of the Grand Canyon. But you speak of the road that leads you to that view. In terms of the metaphor, it's the car that you drive as the vehicle to lead you to the view of the Grand Canyon. And yet, in meditation terms, the vehicle that you use to reach the view of Dzogchen is meditation. So meditation is the vehicle.
Yeah. Well, if you could think, let's go to the Grand Canyon. You get in your car and you drive to the Grand Canyon, and you know how to get there. But if you don't know how to get there, you pull out a map and you follow the map, and it takes you to the edge of the Grand Canyon. You just get out of your car and you look over the majestic edge, and you just your jaws dropped at the beauty of it. So in the same way, your meditation practice takes you to this view.
Mm.
And the view is your own mind in its natural state. And it truly is as glorious and as spacious and as unending as that view, as looking over the Grand Canyon. And in the book, I kind of, as a metaphor, say the road itself is the Dzogchen training.
Right.
So you're using the road of the training and the car of your practice to get to the view. It's probably an imperfect metaphor, but the metaphor of the view of looking over the Grand Canyon, I think, is quite apt. It's just mind-blowing. It really does. I speak of it as ego collapsing, which is essentially mind-blowing, because, when you do recognize that, oh my God, that's my own awareness, that's my own natural state I'm looking at in my meditation. Now, again, you don't want to get attached to that, but you observe it objectively, and all you're doing is getting to know it. You're just becoming familiar with it.
Right.
And the more you become familiar with it, wisdom comes up through this opening.
Right.
Through the spaciousness, and that wisdom kind of saturates your whole being.
We know that meditation is good for us. We've now had many, many scientific experiments conducted through analytics of the body, how it responds to meditation. Obviously, when you're in that state of abiding calm, all sorts of neurological benefits can happen, stress relief. The idea that you bring up in the book is really interesting, because you speak to the idea that through a daily practice, and of course we're not talking about meditating once in your lifetime, we are talking about a practice that you commit to, preferably on a daily basis, where over a period of time you will experience a reduction in your everyday life of anxiety, fear, anger, and depression. And then in return, you will actually experience an increase in love, joy, and compassion.
Yeah.
How does that actually work? How does that happen?
Well, it happens, the meditation practice, if you haven't recognized your own natural state, but you're still meditating, you're always going to be battling all of the maladies and anxieties that we as human beings experience every day, because we're still very much bound to the body. These things come up because we're identifying with the body. And we do this unconsciously. It's not like, like we want to be identifying with the body, even though in the contemporary world, the body is revered, and, beautiful bodies are revered, and, like everybody's trying to, adorn their bodies in countless ways. This, of course, ironically leads to unending suffering, because When that body isn't revered in the way you want it to be revered, it creates anxiety, it creates depression, anger, there's all kinds of reactions, and it happens on very subtle levels, so you're not totally aware of it. But, fear comes up in this body, and which is why many people want to meditate in the first place, because they're trying to understand, where's this all coming from? All of that remains until you begin to recognize that this is not our natural state. This is our conceptual state. When you begin to recognize the natural state, it's not even like you try to, all these years you've been trying to get rid of your anxiety and overcome your depression. Once you recognize through your meditation the natural state, it just begins to vanish. It disappears on its own. And
Right.
I'll say this from experience. I had anxieties growing up and incredibly shy. And, when my brother died, I went through a depressed period of about a year of just like really considering this world and this life. And I recognized my own depression. I recognized that, no, this has really affected me. And when I began to recognize and rest in my own natural state of awareness, it all just disappeared. Just as they had been saying all along, all the great masters will say, it doesn't stay with you, because
Right.
you're now entering a new sphere. And this sphere is within you, it's accessible, it's easy to identify if you have the teachings to show you where it is. We've all actually experienced it without recognizing it, and recognizing it is key. And once you begin to recognize, and then, like the metaphor says, if you know where it is, you get in your car and you drive to it.
Right.
In meditation, you know where this mind is, so you just sit down and you meditate and you arrive there.
Right.
And in arriving there, witnessing it, you get up after you're done and you feel different. It's like some of this stuff is dropped away, that old stuff that's been baggaged, and you're carrying it around, and it's no longer as heavy, and then suddenly it's gone.
Right. Yes. Yes.
So it just happens.
Yeah. So it's not about you training yourself to let it go.
No, it just
No,
happens.
It just falls away.
But like even Mingyur Rinpoche talks about this when he this great, also Urgyen Rinpoche's son,
Yes.
Sonyen Rinpoche's brother, great master. Up until a couple of years ago, this is a recognized tulku. He's a reincarnation of a master.
Yes.
And throughout this whole life, he's been getting the highest teachings of the land since childhood, from his father, from his brother, from these great teachers. And even he was riddled with anxiety, until he threw himself out into the world, started walking the planet, nearly died, but came, settled in that near-death experience, settled fully into his non-conceptual state, that
Yes.
state that you're aiming to recognize in meditation. And he too, all of it disappeared.
Yes.
All of his anxieties, his fears, his shyness,
Yes.
his lack of confidence. So we're all saddled with these experiences.
Right.
And this is the one thing that just says goodbye. It just lets it all go. It's amazing.
Yes. Yes. And this idea that in once these maladies, as it were, just begin to dissolve and dissipate from our being, what is returned to our experience of life, of this precious human
Yeah.
life, is love, joy, and compassion. And the Dzogchen teachings specifically speak to this idea of compassion. And it isn't just an idea, it's very much a practice. Not only are you committing to the practice in order that you may awaken, but you're actually committing to the practice for the benefit of all sentient beings, that all sentient beings may one day awaken.
Yeah. And again, it's not like you're training yourself to love more or training yourself to become more compassionate. It also comes quite naturally when your fear disappears, when your anxiety disappears, when your depression disappears, your anger disappears. This stuff rises up to fill that
in its
space.
place.
Because these are the natural energies of the universe. You know, love, compassion, these things are just like water coming up from the earth and through a natural spring.
Yes.
You know, unless that spring has been polluted with the anxieties and the depressions and all of these things, it's pure, and that purity is love, compassion, joy, all these things. So these things rise up in you in place of everything that's been let go of.
Yes.
And it just happens very naturally. Now, yes, there is practices that you can develop this as well. There's a whole tradition going on there. But if you want to cut straight to the chase, recognize your own mind, go within, and you'll start to experience this idea of love.
Entering the Mind by Sivan Hassett is available at enteringthemind.com.